All right. Well, welcome. I'm Patricia Baquedano Lopez. I'm the chair of the Center for Latino Policy Research. It is really, really exciting to have you all here and to have this event to launch an important project here. Well, the project has been launched, but our discussion of the project is very significant and very important for us. We have had a wonderful year and a wonderful semester. Last semester at the center, we launched the Berkeley Policy Forum, the Berkeley Latino Policy Forum, and then last semester we had a conversation about the importance of making research, our intellectual interest, to matter in questions of equity and social justice. And so having today Professor Gloria Rodriguez is exciting because it's precisely bringing into focus those questions that we've been grappling with as a community, not just here at Berkeley, but in the Bay Area, California, and really the nation at large. So we're very, very excited to have you here. And what I'll do very briefly is to provide an introduction to some of your accomplishments and just to get a sense of where your work is situated, and also of the wonderful opportunity we'll have to speak to hear Mary Louise Frampton open the conversation more formally. So I'll just say that Professor Rodriguez has been assistant professor at our neighboring school and sister school, UC Davis, and we're very excited that she's there. Her expertise is in educational policy and governance, and of course she's interested fundamentally, intellectually in educational equity, leadership, and the status of language minority students and issues in schooling. And she's interested in Latina and Latino educational issues. And she is a scholar of great importance in the field of school finance. Her work is cited constantly at my colleagues at my school. So it's very exciting to have you here for that reason alone, professionally. And she is also very interested in the intersection of schooling, curriculum, and community change. She received her PhD in Education Administration and Policy at Stanford University, and she has been at the College of Education as faculty at the College of Education and Allied Studies at California State University, Hayward, East Bay. And she has received numerous awards, including a dissertation award by the American Education Finance Association. And she has been chairing committees and representing as a very unique stance on Latino education and finance for the American Educational Research Association, and also for the Committee on Academic Program Review, also at California State, Hayward, East Bay. And we will know more about the work today, but I just want to say that what is also inspiring about this work is the leadership in thinking collaboratively and in pushing collaborative research agendas for change. So that is very humbling and very inspiring. I'm going to turn to introduce Mary Louise Frampton, who's the director of the Felton Henderson Center for Social Justice here at UC Berkeley. Mary Louise Frampton has a long record of involvement in social justice issues, so the match here is not coincidental. We are really, really excited to have both of you talking today about the issues that concern us so primarily here in the Bay Area. She has been a civil rights practicing civil rights attorney, and she has worked on issues of employment and discrimination. And in particular, she has represented community coalitions that cut across the racial lines and genders that were seeking and have sought to increase diversity in hiring and programming in television networks. And I can't wait for that work to also influence hiring and practices here at the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you for that work. We're very, very excited to see how your agenda unfolds here, continues to unfold here. And she has been named in 2003 the National Bell of Scholar by the Public Interest Committee of the American Association of Law School. So in short, this is a wonderful set of just ideas and work, but also of great minds that are accompanying here today. And I want to welcome in particular our colleagues from UC Davis and our students and community members from the Bay Area. And that's it. And I will then turn to Mary Louise. No? Can we go first? Yes. Oh, good. So this is the exciting part, right? We're flexible, we're collaborative. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so as some of you know better than others, it takes me a little while to get into character, but you know, I'm trying to be fully myself. So first of all, I wanted to thank Patricia, Dr. Bacana Lopez, and Professors Rachel Moran and Mary Louise Frampton for really being so supportive when, as Rachel was just noting, this is still kind of like a dream, not quite come true. It's a project that really was something that I wanted to do for a long time, but I appreciate, Patricia, you're framing it as my spirit of collaboration, when in fact I realized that there were many other people who understood dimensions of the issues much better than I did, and so I invited them to come in and help me really with this project that has turned out to be, I guess, the beginning of some very important and hopefully lifelong relationships with folks. I also wanted to acknowledge that we do have, and I believe we have one more contributor on her way, but Julie Lopez Figueroa, Professor Figueroa, is one of our contributors who I noted in our acknowledgments as the midwife of this project, because she really came through at a time when things were crucial. So helped us meet our final deadlines, and it was amazing. So thank you, Julie, and also really sincere thanks to all the folks who are here. But most especially, I have my brother here, who's never heard me speak about anything serious. So that's a big deal to me. So thank you for being here, and also my colleagues and students. Who have been so inspirational, so supportive, and really keep me going. So thank you. And with that, I want to get started. I guess for me, it's been really important to try to situate this book within a growing body of literature that is not necessarily a part of the school finance literature, but really a part of the broader educational literature, where more and more colleagues are trying to understand what the social justice aims are of public education, of public schools, and also for me and some of my colleagues who are perhaps a little bit more inclined to think beyond the confines of schools, really to understand how we situate schools within the communities that we live in and inhabit in other ways, and to try to understand then how is it that we can grapple with this idea that in fact, while we might chip away at inequities within schools, we really can't be satisfied, I think, by treating schools as just safe havens and not really thinking about what is it that happens in the exterior of those schools that really comes to bear inside the schools, and likewise, what are the potentials then that exist for affecting positively what goes on in our communities through public schooling. So as I expressed to my colleagues, because I was recently reviewed by my colleagues, which is kind of a weird thing. You always suspect that someone's talking about you, but then it's confirmed because they're supposed to talk about you. But I expressed to my colleagues that sometimes the questions I ask and the things that I care about end up putting me in kind of a lonely place as a scholar, or so I thought. So Blanca, I wanted to thank Blanca for our conversation at lunch, because she reminded me that isolation is a choice. just as collaboration is a choice. And so, so for today, I wanted to engage you in a discussion that is about the challenges of initiating a dialogue, but reminding myself in that moment that I'm not just talking to myself this time. So, with that, it was pointed out in the flyer and elsewhere that a key question that I want to continue having you think about as we progress through today is, what does social justice have to do with school finance? And that's usually one immediate point of sometimes contention and sometimes just miscommunication or talking past each other that I experience with different folks, particularly in the field of school finance. And I think that we'll talk a little bit about why that might be true. But I also think that for a variety of reasons in our society, we're not always welcomed to the different forums where we might have an opportunity to really make these connections more explicit for ourselves and for each other, and to be able to provide those kinds of reflections that help us to understand what these things have to do with each other and what our role is in clarifying these relationships. So I decided to pose the question here, but I'll ask you to keep it in mind as we continue. So for today, what I really wanted to do was to try to do far too much. And so you bear with me that I think that it's probably important to start off with one of the biggest challenges. My worlds are colliding, so bear with me. Which is that we have multiple definitions, and rightly so, of social justice. And so I think it's important to start with trying to understand what happens when we try to pinpoint definitions of social justice, and what might be problematic about trying to find one single definition of that term and of that concept. And in doing so, I wanted to be able to share with you what we attempted to do in this book, and you all can let us know if we were successful at least introducing this idea that that we believe there is a social justice methodology. In other words, a way of framing our worst fears, and realizing that there are particular and intentional practices that we undertake in the course of trying to understand the issues that affect our society. And as researchers, okay, I'm not seeing the B. As long as I know where it is, I'm okay. As researchers, I think that it's very important to make explicit what our processes are, to be as transparent as possible, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about what we did in different ways throughout the chapters in the book. And then provide you with really a very brief overview. I selfishly want to spend time having you help me grapple with what I presented in my chapter in the book, but I still wanted to give you a sense of what the book was about. In particular, because I am very proud of the contributions that were made, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why in a second. So the other thing too is to be able to share with you through an analysis of my chapter what I perceive to be some possibilities that exist for initiating that dialogue, and then again to be able to think together about why it is that such dialogue really is prevented and why it's so challenging to be able to engage in that. So, starting with, I'm going to integrate some advice to students who are working on dissertation proposals and qualifying papers. If you have a sentence that takes you 3 breaths to finish, it's too long. It's too long, people. All right. However, in defining social justice, and this was great because it was one of the first challenges that we met in my colleagues and I when we launched this project, and Jorge Ruiz Velasco was part of the initial launching retreat, where it was certainly an issue that came up right away, that we had different perspectives even around the table of the contributors of folks who were interested in doing this volume together. of social justice. And I would say that having gone through the experience of looking for literature that was relevant and so forth to support our work, that sometimes people just launch into the work as though everyone knows what social justice is and there's an agreed upon definition. And at other times, it's the onus is on us to really be able to say, well, given these kinds of shared experiences, this is what social justice seems to mean. This is what seems to be the goal. So in our attempts, we were really framing this as researchers as well as members of society and members of our communities who try to take action in particular ways. So I'm going to read it for you, even though I know it's up here. Using the means available to us as members of society and as scholars to strive toward the elimination of bias and oppression based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and all other forms of subordination. Pause. And then the latter part, to actively work toward securing full democratic participation for all members of society. And so in all of that, probably, you know, folks who do extensive narrative analysis could probably spend months just trying to deconstruct this statement. But what we were trying to do is to really draw on the widely used characterizations of social justice, but to insert in that a certain sense of responsibility that other scholars have actually talked about on behalf of researchers, on behalf of those who really occupy relatively privileged spaces in our society, but also occupy a position where you can, in fact, not just say something, but do something to begin to reinvent institutions, to begin to change the nature of relationships that exist in our society. And in that partnership with community members and other advocates, we're able to imagine a different day and in fact work toward that together. So two of the opening premises that were used to introduce the book, I'll share with you. And this is really just to articulate that we try not to sound so idealistic as, you know, even as we share these ideas, I know that it comes across as somewhat idealistic, but somebody's got to have hope. So, in that sense, in that spirit, two premises that we have. First, there's a well-documented and long-standing inequality in the distribution of opportunities for individuals and communities to pursue economic, political, and social self-determination. And two, one role of educational policy is to intervene in situations where inequities exist and facilitate improvements that better serve the democratic principles of access, participation, and enhanced life chances. So within that idea that these are our operating premises, this is our starting point for this book project, this is why we felt that it was very important to try to capture our idea that, you know, we are in a collaborative process. However, there are likely to be limits to that process if we rely only on education policy to advance these broader goals. So it's one strand and it's going to have its limits. So as I said, one of the things that was important to us about this book was that we were learning from our colleagues in the field of really, I guess, a combination of people who study social justice commitments in teaching and people who are drawing from multiple perspectives to try to think about what social justice might look like, considering that we really truly have never experienced it in this society. That part of what we felt was the overarching goal here was to surface assumptions and to demystify systems. And then it was certainly my observation when I was inviting people to be a part of the book project was that it seemed that a lot of what was happening was an acute lack of transparency in most of the systems that relate to school finance. And so that becomes problematic, but I realized that in doing the kind of work that I wanted to do in this field, that I would have to step out of that group of scholars, not because it wasn't productive to engage in certain aspects of that conversation, because certainly I would say all of the scholars who I worked with in the field of school finance are very equity minded. So they are very attuned to certain definitions of equity and then work toward that in many of their analyses. But I think there was something very particular about taking on the responsibility to frame school finance within a social justice approach. And so what we figured was that we would want to make explicit, again, in bridging the conversation between folks who might pick up a book and feel very familiar and very comfortable with this idea of demystification, and folks who are really much more embedded in a traditional treatment of school finance who might be intrigued by this idea. And so, so the 4 dimensions that we noted is really meant to get at this idea of demystification. So surfacing patterns of participation, which include exclusion and forms of treatment as well as outcomes. So really paying attention to what those patterns are, again, within school finance theory and policy. Surfacing assumptions and value judgments that are embedded in policy. And so what's really interesting is that in school finance policy, because there are so many numbers involved, there's this notion that in fact it's very objectively produced. And so one of the things that I actually appreciated from some of the seminal work that was done by Byrne and Stiefel early on in the 80s was that they made explicit this idea that the first thing you do is to make your value judgments very explicit, so that when you conduct then your analysis of equity and whether it exists in a particular system, then in fact you understand where you're coming from and where you're headed, so that you understand who it is that you're trying to, whose lives you're trying to improve through the redistribution of resources, but also how you know you've gotten there. Okay, so making those value judgments very explicit. Reframing issues for a critical understanding. One of the things that I really appreciated from looking at the literature that was more critical but focused on broader educational policy and ed policy research concerns had to do with the ways in which we typically analyze the impact of public policy or education policy, that it's still an assessment based on the intended impact of those who frame the policy, and not necessarily embracing the perspectives of folks who are actually affected by the policy. To understand, for example, when we think about educational outcomes and equity related to education, that in fact community members have their own perspectives on what equity looks like in terms of teaching and learning that may or may not match what technical definitions exist in terms of educational equity and outcomes. And certainly when we think about the kinds of outcomes that are focused upon in the field of school finance, there's going to be a disparity there in thinking about what it is that we're involved in here in education. So reframing issues in a way that centers the communities that really are affected, and to try to understand what it is that they value in terms of investments in education, but likewise to be able to reframe questions that have long been asked in the same way over and over again, so that we can actually get at more productive uses of policy where we actually do have some leverage. And then also to engage in this constant process of inquiry or questioning, so that we actually continue to problematize even those things that we think are working. And so I think that some of what's happened in the field of school finance is that certain approaches and certain modes of interpretation of evidence have really become so, I guess, so stylized and so commonplace that it works. It works for folks. It's smooth, it's sophisticated, but it's not necessarily incorporating an opportunity to continue questioning and to imagine that perhaps we might get at some new ideas for advancing some of the problems that continue to plague us if we're willing to question even that which we think is working. So, in terms of the overview of the book, as I said, I wanted to keep this relatively brief. in order to be able to, I guess, highlight some of the challenges of really digging into some of this information across a variety of constituents. So generally the book is organized into two sections, and so the first section is really focused on theory. I don't know that I actually gave you the entire title of the book. That's so funny. So, to what ends and by what means, the social justice implications of contemporary school finance theory and policy. So the first part, of course, is focused on theory, and we have 4 chapters in this first section. And so the first chapter by Barry Bull, who is a philosopher, he actually presents us with a theory that helps us to understand what would be the various aims of education that could then be analyzed through this filter of social justice, so that we can understand, again, what are the different dimensions of our practice in education, and also what is it that we're trying to accomplish together in terms of social justice by focusing our attention on schools and the types of resources and the level of resources that are allocated to those purposes. In the second chapter, Enrique Alemán provides a really, I think, outstanding and provocative analysis that links I would say a staple, a long-held truth in any kind of economic analysis or school finance analysis, even if it's not made explicit, which is human capital theory, but also linking that and challenging that with critical race theory. And so it was interesting to me that some of the editorial comments we got back on the proposal that we submitted to this book were explicit about, you know, we have far too many treatments of critical race theory in this field, so we don't want to hear anything more about that, because that probably will limit the I guess, I don't know, the popularity, the usefulness of your book. So we then proceeded to incorporate race in almost all of the chapters that we because I couldn't find all those books. I mean, we looked. So I don't know, you know, so I wish it wasn't. This is the only time I wish it wasn't blind review, because it would have been nice to meet that person, to see that person's library, because I could not find all that literature that had these treatments of race in such explicit terms as Alemán's chapter. And so what Enrique does is, I think, really instructive for folks who have now again taken for granted the use and assumptions of human capital theory at this point, and reminds us of the history and its evolution, but also links it in really creative ways, not to eliminate human capital theory, certainly, but to supplement that with an attention to a race analysis that allows us to, again, decenter middle-classness or whiteness as the norm by which everything is assessed, and instead to imagine that human capital theory is going to have its limits if we introduce this notion of race and racism and institutional racism, and how that also coincides and intersects with other dimensions of bias and oppression in our society. So I think he does a really nice job of walking us through it, but also allowing us to see the power and depth of each of those theories, but also what happens when we link them. Then in the third chapter, we have my co-editor, Anthony Roll, and his co-author, Arthur Fuller, take up these ideas of productivity and efficiency. And so I remember that, talk about what does school finance have to do with social justice. Usually when someone introduces the notion of productivity and efficiency in any conversation related to school finance, they tend to come from a more conservative, especially politically conservative stance, and arguing often that efficiency is really a way of reining in our tendency to just throw money at problems. And so, so what I kept encouraging Anthony to do, long before we thought this was really going to be a book, but really when we thought we were going to work on something related to productivity and efficiency only, was I encouraged him to think about how efficiency actually has its place, and perhaps productivity as a concept needed to be challenged a little bit more. Efficiency has its place in terms of how do we really begin to define efficiency in a way that really serves our purposes and acknowledges that in the short term at least we're not going to see large amounts of new money coming into education, but we do have lessons from communities and nations that on relatively limited means are actually, with certain commitments, able to accomplish quite a bit, and without the kind of waste that we see in our systems here. All of that sounds very conservative, right? Of course it does. But, but what I'm suggesting, and hopefully in a provocative way, and I'd like to hear more of what you think, is that by dismissing ideas of efficiency, we, I think, dismiss opportunities to really look critically at the ways we've been managing and conceptualizing our systems, and that perhaps I'm not suggesting that waste occurs simply because we invest in communities of color. In fact, everything about the rest of this presentation is quite the opposite. But instead to say, where do we identify waste and how does that get characterized? So rather than saying, you know, in the spirit of a nation at risk, it's a waste that we have public schools because look at our economy, we're not competitive anymore, I'm not arguing that. Instead I'm saying, who knows if the ways in which we've organized schools and the ways in which we've characterized the relationship between teaching, learning, and economy are actually serving our purposes. So that in fact we may be investing in all the wrong things when we have some very productive and important sources of really important returns right under our noses, and we're not paying attention to that. So that chapter starts to get at some of those ideas and assumptions. In the fourth chapter, Nicola Alexander, who has written in, I would say, very mainstream ways on the issue of adequacy, actually walks us through in her chapter a critique of that concept by introducing then who gets to decide, this question, who gets to decide how much is enough? And how do you identify the relevant communities, the benefactors of all the different policy instruments that are aimed at identifying first what an adequate education is, and then how we begin to measure that in quantitative terms as well as other means. And so here is another opportunity where we have a theoretical notion that many people, in fact, in this room have been involved in trying to enact that into some form of finance practice, and run into difficulties because when we're talking about other people's children, we're probably at more of a sense of ease in saying here are the limits to how much is enough. But when we're talking about our own children, then the sky's the limit. And all of a sudden, there isn't a dollar amount large enough to be able to reflect how much we really believe in education. So it challenges this idea of where do we set the parameters for understanding the relevant community that we're trying to influence through education, so that we can say in good faith that we have provided an adequate education. And also, what does education mean to the various constituents that we work with? It's going to mean different things to different people. And so I think that in Alexander's chapter, she does a nice job of really, again, trying to surface the assumptions that have now become taken for granted, relationships between education and other goals, and to have us think about how notions of adequacy really become very much socially constructed by the participants who are now in control of framing that. And as several people at lunch pointed out, we have many economists involved in that process. But having majored in economics, I can't claim being an economist, but you know, they have a special place in my heart. So you know, it's not useful then to dismiss that work. So I need to zip along. All right. So this is going to be brief. This is brief for me, I think. So, so we have the social justice implications of school finance policy. Here, you know, it's really an opportunity to get into some of the practice that flows from the theories that are grappled with in the first 4 chapters. And so in this case, we have 4 chapters that really highlight different areas of school finance and actually broader educational policy. And in fact, my colleague here and dear friend Sarah Gonzalez is one of the contributors of these chapters. Chapter 5, the first chapter, and the second section is mine. We'll get into that in a little bit. We also took up the resource implications of No Child Left Behind and being able to recruit and retain highly qualified teachers for ELs. And in the chapter following that, and that was co-authored with James Rodriguez, David Berliner and Steve Heinemann actually contributed the last 2 chapters of this book. And so in terms of initiating dialogue, as both a junior scholar and the co-editor of this book, that was my first lesson in the difficulties of initiating dialogue, because in fact we had some very strong and differing views related to the connection between school finance and social justice. And in particular, I was editing these papers and having a really interesting exchange where some of the work started off being very strongly influenced by the culture of poverty literature, 70s and really into the 80s. And so, so it was a fun process to edit those papers, but to have this, sometimes, you know, moments of rage, to be honest. And so, yeah, so that said, what we have, I think, is an interesting set of chapters that really take up all these different dimensions, including how we might expand our notion of education policy and understand that it needs to be situated, in David's chapter, it needs to be situated within a more complex understanding of how all social policies and the private sector really need to step up and work in a more integrated fashion if we're really to be serious about social justice aims. Likewise with Steve's chapter, with Dr. Heinemann's chapter, it was really an effort to identify those lessons learned on the international front using foreign aid as the focus. Here's where, you know, I challenged a little bit in terms of saying the donor and recipient relationship is a power relationship. And so I invite you all to check out that chapter and see if you can see some of our negotiations sort of flowing through those pages. That was fun. So, all right. So I don't know if I'm going to get through it. How many minutes do I have, Bianca? Okay, right. Okay. So we may just go with this slide, except that I can't just go with this slide. So I'm going to make some choices. All right. So I guess briefly I wanted to share with you that in my chapter, I was very concerned and could not articulate for quite a while what was bugging me about school finance as it related to Latinos from the time that I did my dissertation. And so I think that what was helpful to me, pardon me, was to understand the language of cultural deficit thinking. So, and to understand that what was really problematic was that, again, when you have situations of disparities in educational outcomes that are treated separately from disparities in educational inputs, one solution is to link those and to get at this idea of adequacy. But another thing is to really dig deeper and to say we don't accept that in a society there have to be haves and have-nots. When we want to get at what are some of the root causes that lead us to what I refer to as a cycle of disappointing results. So in whose interest do we perpetuate a system where we can predict those school communities that remain at the lowest levels of achievement by narrow measures of learning? And at the same time, even as we invest more dollars in a system, then we don't stop to really think about the relationships that existed long before those systems were even in place in our communities, so that those legacies continue to be lived out in very powerful ways. So when so in the chapter, I provide a context by doing a brief historical analysis of the California school finance system to point out that it's this haphazardly constructed, I call it the how not to do it state, that this system is really dysfunctional for a variety of reasons, and then when you introduce that as the way in which we invest in education for a very diverse population, we can immediately see that we're going to have problems in terms of reaching consensus about what's important and how to invest in that in California. I suggest in this chapter that one way of approaching this problem is first to eradicate the use of cultural deficit explanations for the disparities in outcomes that we see in our educational system. And I go through this process of really being able to delineate what would be possible for us to accomplish if we started an approach that did not locate all of the problems of schools on the shoulders of children, but instead to think about what is it about our institutions and their lack of responsiveness to student needs that render these very predictable disparities in outcomes. And likewise, once we get a handle on that, how is it that we can start investing differently in education that while we still have to acknowledge needs, and a dilemma emerges because our system is now built on trying to provide additional resources to school districts that have higher levels of certain kinds of needs, we still need to take stock of our assets. And so I found the work of Terry also to be incredibly helpful. Again, another person who does critical race theory work, so completely ignoring the advice and deciding that it was in fact helpful to keep race at the center of our thinking. Not to say that it's to the exclusion of class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, other forms of bias and subordination, right? Our definition. But really to say that when you have a system that is inherently racist in terms of initial deliberate actions to exclude certain communities from certain opportunities, that you can certainly change those systems at the margins, but unless you're really willing to continue grappling with that longer lasting impact of that starting point, then we continue to be really frustrated. Advocates, as well as policymakers and researchers, we continue to be frustrated by the fact that the dollar amount continues going up, but the outcomes are flatlining, and in some cases, children are doing worse for having been in those systems. And so, so for me, that seems problematic to continue in that cycle, given that we're researchers. So shouldn't we turn to science, the science of our work, and say, if we have these persistent problems, then we should leave no analysis opportunity unturned to be able to think about how else we might frame these issues. So I wanted to share some sample data with you to begin thinking about how we might invest differently. But what I will do instead, in the interest of time, is to be able to share with you that I attempted to link two frameworks, a standard school finance equity framework and what I call a critical community strengths framework, to see that we have, again, some like-minded colleagues who attend to the issue of equity in school finance, but we also have some important work being done by critical scholars who take that to the next step, and to say we're not satisfied with just marginally changing the distributions, but instead we want to understand what are the ways in which we as researchers minimally and other community members certainly can begin to create and develop the evidence for what the legacy of these disparities has been, and how do we work together to start investing in more powerful and optimistic ways. So, again, looking at Yasso's framework, she reframes the notion of cultural deficits by saying that what happens to children who have grown up in poverty, or who are immigrants, or who are children of color, or otherwise marginalized in our society, is that we tend to only look at their needs and we don't understand what it is that they bring to their classrooms and learning environments that we could actually build on if we chose to invest in a different way in what she talks about as cultural capital, and what I would also synonymously refer to as assets versus deficits. I think it's more vivid. When the data that I was going to share with you is actually found in a couple of tables in the book chapter, but basically that you have 20 districts that were sample districts with high concentrations of Latino students in California, and high concentration I define as 30% or greater. And that most of those districts tended to have relatively high, greater than 50% participation in reduced price or free lunches. There were relatively high percentages, at least 25% or more, who were English learners. Smaller percentages who were considered fully English proficient. And these are districts that really represented all the regions of the state. And I was trying to find all the cities I've lived in, because it was my chapter. So my is in there. Sacramento's in there, you know. So Palo Alto's not in there, but I think some of you who know me well probably know why. Santa Clara is in there, San Jose. There are districts from Fresno County in there. And so you can imagine, right? So thinking about the schools that you know well that have also very low API, Academic Performance Index scores, very low scores, relatively speaking, and yet by the standards that have been enacted by our courts are considered equitable in terms of the amount of resources they receive for basic funding. So the disparities that exist are within the allowable disparities across those districts. So on average, about $6,000 per pupil, even across those districts. And some of them have significantly more when you look at their total revenue, which includes their special money. But still you have these poverty factors. And so thinking about what kinds of images get conjured up when you think about those school communities. Now my colleagues in school finance tend to invest in those communities by addressing the needs and ignoring what I think are some important assets. Lisa in her group. So I'm just going to run through these photos for you. This was an event that occurred not too long ago at our campus at UC Davis. It was an open community event, free, for children ages 5 through 18, and involving several of our Chicana and Latina students, and Chicana and Latino students. Now, when we think in terms of those communities that we just talked about, my colleagues in school finance tend not to look at these communities in these ways. Okay? So we have here opportunities to reframe this participation as the potential for linguistic, familial, and social capital. Okay? Linguistic capital to be able to tap into the kinds of richness of uses of language that are not just the standard treatments of language, but can include things like spoken word or rap or poetry, or the kinds of curriculum that were used by our college students and graduate students to be able to communicate both with children and parents in sharing a cultural practice, in allowing them to understand regions of dance and dance style in Mexico. Familial and social capital. For those of you who have worked in schools, how many times have your colleagues said to you, we just can't get parents to participate? And many of them are not as ambitious for their children as they could be. So here's a Saturday morning picture of parents who are probably dead tired from working all week, but still manage to go to a full day of this sort of event in order to provide this opportunity for their children, and that there's something else going on for those students as they interact with a real live college educated Chicana or Latina, or Latino in some cases. Likewise, we see similar manifestations potentially of the forms of capital in these pictures. In the top picture, as the instructor there was letting them know what Veracruz was about and where it was located and the particular dances that originate there, one of the things that she said as a requirement is to have a fan. And so the child sitting next to her remembered from her class in her school that there's a way to ensure that when you fold the fan that you can get perfectly even dimensions on that fan by continually folding something in half. So for those of you who have taught math, we know that we're just half a step away from then understanding the concept of limits, of really being able to understand infinity. If you keep folding something in half, you can keep doing that forever. Those are mathematical concepts that are deemed to be far above the ability of Latinos who can't score at proficient levels in these narrow definitions of academic skill. Okay? And so likewise, you can see that there are other things that we take for granted, perhaps from our college-age population. Navigational and resistance capital, the very act of being a Latino college student is already a form of resistance because you're providing a stance in those institutions that is not necessarily the taken for granted norm of those institutions. And you're doing it in a way that you're sharing what you know about college as well as what you know about your cultural heritage with community members. So, also, most of these children, probably if they are not themselves, have family members who are immigrants in this country, and so have been placed in roles of translating for their parents, or they've had to navigate in a variety of ways through social systems and social services systems that are far more sophisticated than the most elaborate kinds of systems that we encounter in education, and yet they're the same students that are deemed to be unable, and their parents are unable to understand what it takes to get to college. Okay? So really being able to understand how is it that we can begin to reframe investments in education that take into account these dimensions and that hopefully provide a more optimistic view of the possibility for returns rather than having us continually framing it only as investing in a way that tries to mold these children more like the norm upon which schools were premised to begin with.
You know, this is too important an issue for the public to confine ourselves to the academic discussion. What we really need to do is to think about how we can build upon this work rather than critiquing it to death. To me, school finance is a social justice issue. It isn't about discussing school finance as a potentially social justice issue. It is a social justice issue. And more particularly, it's an issue of race. And the problem is that we don't discuss it as an issue of race. And so we miss the most important parts of it. And I think we can see this by a very simple question. And that is, would the schools in California be existing in third world conditions if the majority of the children in those schools were not children of color? We know what the answer is. So we can see just from that simple question that this is an issue of race. The problem is in this country we have such a knee-jerk, what I call sort of cognitive dissonance about race. We really want to deny that race is an issue. And so we will go to enormous lengths to try to discuss or analyze a problem in non-racial terms. And so we come out, when we do that, with all the wrong answers. But this is really a tremendous obstacle that we have in discussing race and a critical race approach to school finance. So I want us to think about the challenges of how we take this important work to the next level, how we take it out to the public so it can really influence policymakers, and how we encourage scholars to engage in this kind of work. I mean, I envision research coming out of your ideas, looking at all of these different schools from a critical race perspective, using community-engaged research models. And I really want to talk about that in a minute. So those are the challenges that I see for us. And I just wanted to, since I guess I'm the legal perspective in this group, I just wanted to talk a minute about the Williams case that's discussed in Gloria's chapter to illustrate the difficulties that we're up against in looking at critical race theory and school finance. Now, I think probably all of you know about the Williams case. This was a case that was brought in 2000 by 48 students of color in school districts around the state, asserting that California had failed to give them a minimally adequate education. Now, we needed to bring such a case because of the whole breakdown, the dismantling of Brown versus Board of Education, and the lack of political will to really do anything about our third world conditioned schools. And I wanted to read, and it's fine to talk about this in theory, but bringing it down to the ground, when we talk about third world conditions, I just wanted to read a description of Roosevelt Elementary School in Compton, California. This is an inner city school in Los Angeles. And at the time the Williams case was starting up, public radio was looking for some stories about schools. And this quote comes from a public television and public radio show about Compton, in which my son, who was teaching there at the time, said, Compton has 1,600 students in grades K through 5, 1,600 elementary school students. There are in this school 2 functioning bathrooms with soap and paper towels, a lunchroom that seats 200, no nurse, 5 old computers, outdated books and supplies, and not many of those, no science equipment, no accelerated learning program for high-achieving students, 50 uncredentialed teachers, not 1 blade of grass, and not 1 white student. Now, how can we say, when this is what it looks like on the ground, that this is not an issue of race? So, what the Williams lawyers thought is that if they documented these kinds of conditions in the schools, that the governor would be so ashamed that the case would settle right away. So their strategy was to get all of this information together in a complaint, to file it, to have it be publicized, and of course, the governor would settle the next week, right? Because how could California possibly have schools like this? And in the lawsuit, although they raised the issue of race, they brought an equal protection claim. They decided that, whoa, people don't like to talk about race, so we're not going to emphasize this. Instead, we're going to focus on the right to education that's in the California Constitution and discuss sort of adequacy for all students, and let's sort of avoid the race issue. And they thought that way the case would settle quickly. Well, as you know what happened, the case did not settle quickly. Instead of responding with shame, what the government did was to say, oh, this isn't our fault. It's the fault of all these local school districts around California. So we're just going to bring all those school districts into this lawsuit, and we're going to retain a very expensive LA firm with partners who are friends of mine, and make sure that for years we're going to litigate about this. So that wasn't something, I mean, you see the kind of resistance to what we think should be shaming information. The government saying, we don't care, essentially. And the defense in this case was basically, you can show us all this information about the fact that there aren't decent teachers, there aren't learning materials, there aren't bathrooms, but in order to win, you have to prove that all of these things really have an impact on these children's ability to learn. That was the defense. Did you read about that in the paper? You didn't, did you? And I just wanted to all right, so the government argued, I just wanted to quote this. It argued that if even one child is able to achieve in these deplorable conditions, it proves that educational resources are not central to learning. This is a quote from briefs. The defense experts contended that, quote, family and peer group backgrounds, got this? Cultural deficits, have the strongest effect on student learning, and the, quote, handicaps of impoverished and uneducated backgrounds have proven to be very intractable, end quote. Blame the kids. Again, cultural deficits, not looking at all the assets. And this one, I mean, coming out of one hearing in LA, one defense attorney said, quote, these kids can't read anyway, so why should we give them books? This is what our government was arguing in the Williams case. Not only were the lawyers arguing this, but in the depositions that they took of all these elementary school kids, their approach was to absolutely badger these kids. So when kids were testifying about not having bathrooms to go to, or it being in classrooms where the rain was coming in, or the cockroaches were coming across there, what they would do is, if the child who was being deposed had even maybe gotten a B in a class, the lawyers would then say to these children, well, this didn't prevent you from getting a B in this class, didn't prevent you from learning, right? You learned anyway. And these poor kids, who frankly had not been well prepared by the lawyers, just fell apart, as you can imagine. But that was the legal tactic. So you can see, although in your chapter you talked about the disappointments in the settlement, after going through this millions of dollars that were spent by the state on the defense of this case, that finally the plaintiffs are thinking, oh, we've got to settle and at least get something out of this, because the outrage that we had expected here never developed. And in a way, by not using race in the complaint, which I think there was certainly a good basis for initiating that strategy, it really hurt in the long run, because they couldn't then bring it back later on to issues of race, which were really central to Williams. So, and in a way you can say that something good did come out of Williams. There is increased school financing. Certainly not enough, and the problem with all these adequacy lawsuits, as you pointed out, is that instead of being a floor, gee, you actually get to have an open bathroom with toilet paper. You get to have a book that you can take home. Then instead of those being the minimums, now that's the aspirational goal. So So, but the kind of mindset, when you see what happened with that case, I think that's a good illustration of the difficulty that we're up against because of the way in which the society views race and the inability to analyze things from a unconscious racism, implicit bias, structural racism perspective. So I think that this, into that little wedge of opportunity here to talk about school finance from a racial point of view, I think bringing in the critical race analysis is just key. And my question is to all of you: how do we take this work that is so important and get it out there? How do we get your chapter to be in Peter Schragg's column? How do we get this to influence policymakers? And how do we, in addition, encourage the scholarship that's going to build on this, that is going to demonstrate in looking at schools that this approach really works, that it will give us the answers that we need to really improve our schools. And there's going to be enormous resistance because the political will to put the kind of money into the schools that are necessary to really educate our kids to be fully participating members of this democracy, it's not there. And we're going to have to use very persuasive techniques where we discuss race but don't make people feel defensive in order to do that. And that's our challenge, it seems to me. And it's a difficult one, but it's a one that we can't, this problem is not going to be solved unless we do that. School finance is not our answer. School finance without that critical race lens deludes us into thinking that, gee, we've provided equitable funding, right? Since we've provided equitable funding and these kids of color are still failing, well, it's their fault, right? Cultural deficit, instead of admitting that we have a major system failure here. So we really have to revamp the system. So let's open it up for questions.
Yes. So we have a good 10 minutes for discussion. I thought I would say that. So. Yeah. There's a hand in the back. Or are you just waiting? You've been
I was waving at the person.
Oh, she has a question though.
So many more than one. I guess one question is, do we know, is there enough research that to say what are the structural and systemic changes that need to be made?
Is there enough research?
And where would the money fit into that? I mean, because I have heard, and I've asked this question of some of the policymakers, and the response that I've gotten is, it's kind of what the state has been saying, that if you set the bar high enough and have an expectation that everyone will succeed, then they will. And to say anything else is to be racist, because that's to say that they can't succeed.
But I think what that doesn't take into account, and I know you, maybe I'll just be fast while you're thinking about this, because you look like you were cogitating about it. I mean, in our schools, we've got 90% of our teachers are still white, and all the social science has shown that in the interaction of these white teachers with one another, they talk about their kids in the back rooms in very racially stereotyped ways. Now, when they're talking publicly, they don't do that, of course. But that's what, I mean, we have the social science to demonstrate that a great deal of racial and ethnic stereotyping is going on. Even though those teachers themselves may think of themselves as being good-hearted and not being discriminatory, and maybe in some cases that's true. But because of their unconscious biases, they're still labeling these children, and no matter what the law may say, in their own minds, they don't have the expectations for these kids. So in terms of social science on that, I think there's a great deal of it. We need more, but I think we know at least what some of the problems are. And this is not my area of expertise at all. That's Gloria's, but I just wanted to say that's, from a legal point of view, that's, we've got enough to argue about this. We've got enough social science to argue this from a legal point of view. Whether there's enough scholarship from an academic point of view, that's...
Yeah. I guess the reason why I paused was because I really believe that we do have all the research we need. I was saying this at lunch. I think what we lack is political will to make these things happen. So it's interesting that conveniently when there is I guess a proposal on the table to try to make things more truly equitable, then the holes are poked in all of the social science research that we have available. When there's another use for that same research, then all of a sudden we're a little bit more forgiving, I think. But a lot has to do with political will, and so it elevates in my mind the very value of public education. So why we're not able to influence those discussions in a variety of levels. So not just as scholars, but also as community members. You know, the big challenge that I think persists is that we continue to talk in one circle about the money aspect of our educational system, and then we talk about all of the programmatic issues and teaching and learning issues in entirely separate circles. So rarely do those circles overlap, and rarely do even researchers in those areas really collaborate in order to try to understand what those structural changes would really need to be. And so when I asked my colleagues who are specialists as well in school finance why that is so, I think that there is this mix of being uncomfortable with teaching and learning as this part of education that they know is important, but is hard to quantify. It's hard to characterize in the ways that make it easy to say, here's where we invest, and that without a doubt it's going to produce these very measurable kinds of results. And likewise, in very, you know, down-to-earth terms, there's math phobia. And so in the other direction. So I've been at times really frustrated by teachers who I know have so much to offer because they are language acquisition specialists. They work with kids. They know what the issues are in terms of teaching and learning, to try to get them to discuss those resource implications, which I think why Sarah and James's chapter was important. It's really like pulling teeth, because I think that finance conjures up again a very exclusionary aspect of educational practice that other educators and even other researchers are reticent to participate in. And so we end up in this situation where if we could just get people to put down their egos for a second and say, if we're truly here to advance broader purposes related to making schools better places for children and their teachers, then there's really actually something that we can start to think about together. And so any change that you propose in terms of curriculum is going to have financial implications. And likewise, if you're going about changing the way we invest in schools, that immediately has implications for what you can do, and pedagogically and all these other dimensions as well. And so the cross-fertilization of ideas, I think this is why I was inspired to try to get other folks to help me think about how do you start chipping away at that problem of dialogue and really knowing what the entry points are, and, you know, grasping those opportunities where you find them. And so, you know, just the insider knowledge that's required in any of those aspects and being able to bridge that, you know, continues to be a challenge. When you introduce that whole milieu to then the policymaking arena, where the attention span, I'm going to give it to them for good reason, is short. Then you run up against, you know, I appreciate your studies, I don't have 10 years. So, you know, can you tell me what I can do in the next round of legislation. So then there's another disconnect in terms of talking past each other, wholeheartedly wanting to support what's right for kids, especially the ones in their districts, but not necessarily finding those entry points. And personally, as a researcher, I feel like it's my responsibility somehow to be able to do some of that bridging, but I know that is kind of above and beyond the call of most researchers' sense of their duty.
There's a question back here or there. I can't see over there. Sorry. Yeah, back there. Yeah.
Then I guess since the state is deeply engaged in school finance questions this year, I wondered. I think what's powerful about your book is that it's so much more about sort of changing attitudes and resources per se. So I guess I was thinking. I know you just made a comment that there's sort of impatience in legislation, and yet I'm asking you, if you were sort of to give, sort of based on what you've learned from this, suggestions within this arena for policy changes on school finance, how would you target resources to, in fact, change attitudes in the bigger sense?
Yeah, I really think that seeing is believing. And so in the same way that I felt that in a matter of a couple of hours of going to an event that seemed, like thousands of other community events that exist in our communities, that for those school leaders who take the initiative to invite legislators to their districts and to their schools, to really be able to demonstrate for them in very real terms what the potential is in their schools, based on a piecing together of different pots of resources and money and grants, that in fact you can advance all of the same kinds of aims, but perhaps they're going to look a little different than what we expect them to look like. And so that's, to me, that's a huge part of the attitude change, to try to at least meet our legislators halfway, and to be mindful of how they're not likely to take the initiative for a variety of really practical reasons to go out and visit schools. They're not necessarily going to know where is the evidence that exists, and how do I now link that to the social science research that is more generalizable to other similar communities. So that's one starting point, so that translation work, but then to actually say, and it exists in real terms, and I can point to it, and I can show you this school community where leadership from the office of the principal to among the teachers to the community members actually makes a difference when the resources are invested in a way that you're really moving towards some sort of shared sense of purpose, and that there's accountability. And so I think that unfortunately the term accountability has now become so misused that there's another, I think, a really rich opportunity to be able to say, here are teachers who are really holding themselves to pretty high standards because they are trying to implement high expectations, but they're really under the radar screen, because I think that we're not expecting that from communities that have high concentrations of low-income children or children of color. So it wouldn't even occur to us sometimes to go in and visit schools where that's really happening. So so I really believe the combination is really, really powerful, and that's why I really try to encourage educators to make it their business to do that kind of outreach. And I know, some of our graduate students actually are really great about doing that, but it does require being kind of savvy about that.
Don't you see a series of articles in the Sacramento talking about this? Looking at the schools, looking at the statistics, at the social science research, and right there under the legislation, under the legislators' noses, they don't even have to go anywhere. They can just read the paper.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't give Texas too much credit for anything that I've learned, but I learned quite a bit being in a border community, and knowing that when you're that far physically and in lots of other ways from the state capitol, they took a lot of initiative to demonstrate in very real terms what changes to the school finance formula would mean for their schools and districts, positive and negative. So and likewise taking into account recommendations for efficiency that were well-founded looking for areas of waste so that you can, in fact, go back to what you think are your assets. And these are the same districts who made choices about investing in the arts for all the children. That was part of being an educated person and being able to demonstrate that.
So I have students here who
And there was a hand
projects, and there were 2 or 3 different funding streams that they could look at to see how they would impact education. What would you suggest they look at?
2 or 3 funding streams. Well, I think that you point to one problem in education, which is that we have a colleague, Tom Timor, who focuses on categorical programs, and I do have a student who's working on resources related to English learners. So I would definitely support some further analysis. Irina has started on resources that can be used to support English learners in the kinds of ways that we're talking about here. But the problem in California is that we have very much a piecemeal system of categorical or special programs that are aimed at particular either equity goals or teaching and learning goals. And so, and likewise, there is no equalization of those resources, and many of those resources have come from really political decision-making and processes in the rawest form of that, as opposed to saying that the spirit of those dollars was really to match dollars with needs and to be able to trace the needs by seeing those funding streams. So, you know, one of the problems is to really identify whether, in fact, the dollars are following the needs. I think we have some evidence that that's not always the case. But given the growth of the English learner population, and also given that we tend to think of those students as being foreign-born students, but because schools have not changed significantly in their treatment of those issues, we actually have U.S.-born long-term English learners that are not progressing so that they now have access to college preparatory curriculum and opportunities. So, so for those legislators who feel that that's an immigration issue or those are not really our children, and in fact they are our children. So that would definitely be one area that I think is just much needed. I've already seen one meeting where those needs were pretty much dismissed in a matter of a couple of minutes. Again, because the research issue, well, you know, the research is inconclusive about what extra dollars would make an impact on those learners. So we're not going to deal with that. And I was informed that the education subcommittee of the budget committee, likewise, did not spend a lot of time thinking about ELs. 1 in 4 children in public schools is an English learner, and in the K through 2 grade levels, it's 1 in 3. So those children should matter.
Yes. So, Alex, is that?
You sure?
Is that a quick question?
But I wanted to go back to the systemic question that was noted earlier and put in a different way. The governor had this Blue Ribbon Commission. One of your ex-folks from Stanford headed it, and so on. And they came out with a series of recommendations. Given what you said in your book, to what extent was that report paralleling what you were saying, or do you see contradictions between the several points that you make in your book?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the recommendations done by that commission? Is this an example of 2 ships passing each other in the night? Or is it that that report is reflective of these equity things, or more dollars, or is it in fact a hodgepodge of things in which some of the issues that you raised are in there, but too many of the others are in a sense swamping it? And related to the last question, was it in many respects a wish list that realistically the people on that commission should have known better?
Well, you know, I mean, I always think it's important to dream big. So, you know, I think that I would never argue that we have enough resources in our educational system, but that's because I really feel that we all benefit from having those investments there instead of some of the other social institutions that our state and others have chosen to invest in. So I think that it's really important to not discount, you know, the power of recommendations that say that in order to accomplish certain equity goals, we need a far deeper commitment and concomitant resources to go with that commitment. So in that sense, you know, we're walking the same path. But I think that where we differ a little bit is really in the characterization of the communities, and really in the implicit hopelessness of saying, well, we know they're never going to be white, and they're never really going to be middle class, because we're not dealing at all with how economic policy coincides with school finance and other education policy. So this is the best we can do, and there's more, I think, of a well-intentioned but still charitable approach to investing in communities rather than a social justice approach, which really guides us to a place of self-determination, where you have meaningful choices, they're true choices, and you're not being told at a very young age what you're likely going to have as an option. And that's the highest that you can aspire to. So, so as long as someone else is deciding for me or my community what my heights are, then there's going to be a difference in perspective as to how to invest in that. And so it makes sense that people get, you know, very frustrated with the lack of returns seeming from those heavier and heavier investments. And as long as we continue to characterize communities in that way, you know, there's not enough money in the world to make me white. So if that's what you want, then yeah, even if I wanted to. So, you know, so in that sense, it's really kind of having to confront that, you know, how we deal with difference, how we embrace it and don't, and how we value it as a society.
Great, so difficult job to bring all this to conclusion. We always try to make our events as collaborative as we can, and we would like to, on behalf of the center, I would like to thank our co-sponsor, the Institute for the Study of Social Change, and the director, Professor Rachel Moran, and Dr. Christine Trost, Associate Director of ISSC as well. And I want to also thank Dr. Blanca Gordo, our academic coordinator, for all the coordinating envisioning work, and Liz Rubalcaba, who is our important digital graphics and other art at the center. She's responsible for that. I have a couple of reminders, and one is to please, if you have not done so, to sign up. At the entrance there is a sign-in sheet, and we need your signature for us to continue this process and these activities. And I want to also remind you that we are videotaping, and we really videotape the speakers. We have that permission. But if Blanca will ask for some of your responses and reactions, and so just if you feel willing to share with us your ideas, and we'll post those on our website. I want to also invite you, Gloria, and if your collaborators are here, I don't know, others walked in, to have a picture to remember the event. Thank you. And we have copies of the book for sale right here. We thank our bookstore for providing us with copies. And we have Gloria to sign the copies for you. And there's a reception in the parlor awaiting us. And very briefly, just and from the bottom of our hearts, want to thank Mary Louise Frampton, the director of the Dalton Henderson Center for Social Justice, for your work, for your words, but more than anything for your call to action, that this work is not finished, but has just begun. And thank Professor Gloria Rodriguez for your insight, and your collaborators. You and your collaborators invite us to enact social justice methodology that is about change, that it is about transformation, and I almost feel like Barack, about hope. Thank you all for your continued support. Thank you.